All set.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Casey Ryan. I am an assistant professor of criminal justice at Hudson Valley Community College. I also adjunct at a few other SUNY institutions, and I am a faculty mentor for Brightspace at Hudson Valley. So I help faculty with their Brightspace course setup and any issues with Brightspace. I've been using OER for about 7 years now. And one of the approaches that I use when designing my courses and deciding that I want to use OER is thinking about how to make the course accessible to all students, because I'm also a big advocate of using universal design for learning in all my courses as well. I kind of think that UDL and OER kind of go hand in hand. And so I have a lot of references in this presentation to UDL and universal design for learning requirements, because to me, you really, when you're focusing on open educational resources, you're also thinking about how to implement UDL. So I'm going to mention both of them. Just a quick poll, you can use the chat. Does anybody use OER and does anybody use UDL? And also, is anybody teaching criminal justice, or are we all different kind of disciplines? Just curious. Because I am going to reference a lot of very specific criminal justice issues. So I was just curious as to what the disciplines were at this presentation. Well, if you feel like jumping in, please feel free to use the chat. So one of the big reasons why we probably all use open educational resources is that they're free. And that is such a benefit to students, not having to worry about the cost of buying a textbook. I also really like OER because it gives you, as the instructor, a lot of control over the content. You're not necessarily bound by what is in the traditional text. And so you can feel free to kind of bring in maybe more contemporary material, a specific current event that's very relevant to your course content, without feeling that kind of obligation to the traditional textbook. I also, for criminal justice courses, like to use OER because they are very inclusive to all of the experiences that somebody might have within the system. The traditional criminal justice texts are very much focused on the experiences of people who work in the criminal justice system, while the experiences of people who are involved in the system, so people who've been arrested, people who are on trial, people who are in prison, people who are on probation, their experiences are typically not well defined or even mentioned. And so having the ability to use open educational resources oftentimes allows the student to have a much kind of well-rounded perception of how the criminal justice system works. And especially for students who might have been involved in the criminal justice system, or who have a family member or a friend who's been involved. So for example, probation, most commonly used sentence in the US, probably in a classroom of 33 students, statistically speaking, one of those people is probably under correctional control. And so think about all the classes that you have each day, all the students that you interact with, all the people that you're on the bus with, people that you're at the grocery store with. You're going to interact with somebody who is under correctional control. And so our students are part of that statistical probability that probably somebody you know or interact with is going to be involved in the system. And so having open educational resources be available means that I can bring in material that represents those experiences of those students. I also really like open educational resources because it just makes it easier to implement a lot of the universal design for learning principles. And it's pretty convenient to embed right into Brightspace, which means that if a student is on their phone, which they likely are, or is on a tablet or is on a laptop, they can click one link and be brought right to their readings, versus a traditional text where if the student has a physical copy, they have to be with the physical copy. Sometimes they're heavy, they're not going to carry them around. But if the student has that very quick, immediate access that you can embed right into Brightspace, they're going to be much more likely to actually read the material. And then with the traditional criminal justice text, most traditional criminal justice texts are written from the perspective of people who work in the system. They oftentimes do not even mention the experiences of the people who are involved in the system, or they very much minimize their experiences. And so for me, when I was a student, I felt like I wasn't learning everything there was to know about the criminal justice system because it didn't cover the people, right? We're learning about what prisons are, but what about the people that are actually incarcerated in a prison? And so for my students, I like to have the ability to ensure that they are getting kind of the full picture, the full conversation about what the criminal justice system is. So just a quick little overview of UDL, using the third iteration of UDL as this framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for everybody. The two themes of UDL that I think really are representative with OER material is representation and engagement. And this content is directly taken from the UDL site. Having a focus on representation means that in the course material, which to me is essentially whatever readings the students are in, the notes your students are being assigned to, that material is going to represent a diversity of identities, perspectives, and narratives. And a lot of traditional criminal justice texts just don't do that. Considering the perceptions of people, cultures, and languages, and then with engagement, I'm kind of centering, affirming, and sustaining learners' interests and identities because they might be a formerly incarcerated person. They might have a family member who's currently in jail. And emphasizing the role of belonging in teaching and learning. To me, when I was a student and I was in a criminal justice course and we were learning about how in prison, the people that are locked up, those are the quote bad ones, but the corrections officers, those are the good ones. And anything bad that happens in a prison, it's the fault of the people that are locked up. That is completely exclusionary to the experience of someone who maybe has been in prison or has a family member or a friend in prison. Not to mention is not true, but learning in that way really does not make a student feel like they belong in the classroom. If the teaching and all the content and the instructor is stating, yeah, the people that are locked up, those are the bad ones, how does that make you feel any sort of connection or sense of belonging to your learning environment? So a lot of those traditional texts just really did not promote that sense of belonging. And so when I moved to using open educational resources, the things that I looked for were that the content represented all student experiences and promoted an engagement and promoted that sense of belonging, really, most importantly. So I kind of just have a quick little overview of how I feel that UDL and OER kind of go hand in hand, and how I use open educational resources to kind of promote this universal design for learning. So having that traditional text, it's written in a very othering way. The good people, quote, good people, are the criminal justice system professionals. And then you have all the people who are in the system because they were arrested, they're on trial, they're locked up, they're on probation, they're on parole. Those people we're not going to really bother talking about why they ended up in prison or why they were held in jail pre-trial. We're just going to tell you what a jail is and how people can be arrested and why they get sentenced to prison for 30 years. But we're not going to talk about the experiences of people while they're in prison for 30 years. We're just going to talk about things like if violence happens in a prison, it's that person's fault, the people that are incarcerated. So very othering style language is typically used in a criminal justice system text. Even from introduction to criminal justice all the way to a much higher level course like correctional services, juvenile delinquency, very much kind of othering language is used, and just kind of a theme that the criminal justice system is great. It's set up in this really great way, and we should all kind of respect how the system works because everybody who goes through the system receives justice. But that's not the reality of the criminal justice system. And so using open educational resources removes me as the instructor from having to rely solely on that traditional text because it costs a bunch of money, because the students were required to purchase it, kind of felt like I had to use that. But now I can structure a module, a particular content area around this is what a prison is. This is how a prison was set up. This is the history of punishment in prisons. These are the people that work in a prison. And these are the experiences of people who are locked up in a prison. So I have the ability with OER to really highlight the experiences of everyone. And so that there might be students in the class who have a family member who's a corrections officer or who want to work in corrections. Their perspective was always represented with a traditional text. With OER, their experience, their perspective will be represented, but I also have the ability to represent the experiences and the perspectives of people who maybe have been involved in the system. And so everyone benefits from using open educational resources versus a traditional text. Only certain people are going to get their perspective reflected. And having that perspective reflective, to me, that ties right into engagement and having that sense of belonging. If I'm taking a criminal justice course and I have a parent who's incarcerated and all I'm learning about is about people who are in prison are bad, that doesn't make me feel like I have any sort of connection to this material. It doesn't make me feel like my reason for being in this class is really being represented. And so using an OER, variety of topics, variety of perspectives, kind of acknowledging the experiences of people who've been involved in the criminal justice system, those can all be highlighted. And we're not taking anything away. We're still highlighting the role of the staff in the criminal justice system, still highlighting the history of the criminal justice system. But instead of just having that one perspective, now we can have a more diverse perspectives represented. One of the big issues with a lot of textbooks, this is not necessarily specific to the criminal justice system, but with traditional texts, because they are so costly, when new editions come out, you might not necessarily adopt a new edition immediately. And there's usually a few years between each edition. So with the criminal justice system specifically, a lot of times the material is outdated. It might be outdated when it goes to press just because laws change very quickly. And so one example of that is death penalty information. In traditional text, they'll have an overview, a history of the death penalty. They'll highlight some Supreme Court cases related to the death penalty, which you can replicate very easily with OER. And then they'll discuss how the death penalty is used today. And so students will do their reading, hopefully, and they'll read that there are 27 states that have the death penalty. And then they'll come to class, and because I prepared my notes based on the actual numbers that are currently happening now, they'll learn from me that there are 21 states who have the death penalty. And that is conflicting information. And if you're trying to build legitimacy to build engagement in your course, if the textbook is telling the student one thing and you're telling the student another thing, that's not going to help you at all build that legitimacy. So having the ability to constantly update your material, so semester to semester, or if I know I'm teaching the death penalty in 2 weeks and a state just passed a law getting rid of the death penalty, I can go in and I can quickly update. If I generated the material, I can put a link to the Death Penalty Information Center, which consistently updates information as it becomes available. And that way the student has accurate information. And that accuracy just really promotes the engagement, because why would I want to care about this class and care about this material if the text is telling me one thing and my instructor is telling me something else? Who's right? And I guess I'm not going to believe anybody. So having the ability to do that pretty consistent update on a regular basis is so useful with OER. The whole idea of having an inclusive classroom space and making sure that all sorts of different perspectives and experiences are reflected is so important when selecting the materials to use, in particular for criminal justice courses, but when you're kind of building your OER, if you're using a kind of text style OER, or if you're kind of building modules using all sorts of different open resources. One of the ways that I try to ensure that representation when I'm building my OER modules is to think about the realities of the criminal justice system. And so students will receive, just like in a traditional text, that overview of a component of the criminal justice system, the history of it, how it works, but they'll also receive a reality piece. So, for example, in a traditional text, students learn that a jail is used for a very specific reason. A jail is used if someone is awaiting arraignment, they're awaiting trial, or if they've been convicted of a crime and have been sentenced and their sentence is up to 1 year. They learn that. And that's typically kind of all that the jail chapter will focus on, the people that work in the jail, a few of the issues of jails, but that's kind of it. That's not actually how jails work in the US. Jails are super confusing. There's a lot of different ways that jails can be used. And so having the ability to provide students with the actual reality of how jails are used is super beneficial for that engagement, for that representation. And also, I think, just builds legitimacy, because you're not pretending that that's the only way that something works. When a student might be in your class knowing, you know, my brother went to jail and that's not how the jail worked for them. So I just put up a few examples. There is a Vera Institute of Justice article about Kentucky and how in Kentucky, there's such overcrowding in their prison system that they are paying local jails to house people that are supposed to be in prison. Now, people that are in prison, not in jails. But in Kentucky, the reality is that's actually something that's happening. And so if you're teaching in Kentucky, or you have a student from Kentucky and you're learning about jails, they might have a real world experience that's different than what it is being taught. So providing these additional resources, which you can do with OER, helps them feel a little bit of representation in the course. So another example, in California, if you can afford it, you can pay to stay at one of the local city jails, which have like amenities like TVs and private rooms, compared to staying in a very overcrowded county facility. Students tend to really like that article because it is a brand new idea. They've never heard of that. What do you mean you can pay to stay at a jail? What do you mean that if somebody has money, they can go to a different jail? And so that also brings up a lot of discussion points about how your socioeconomic position plays a role in your experience in the criminal justice system, which highlights a lot of inequities in the system, which also really promotes representation and engagement and inclusiveness in the course. So having that article as a jumping off point, but students tend to find these articles just super interesting because it's not like what's on TV. It's not like what's in the movie. It's not like what my other textbook said. It's the reality of how things might work. And just another example is for my criminal justice capstone course, we learn about how the system actually doesn't work. So all their criminal justice courses they've taken, this is how the system works, this is how the system works, and then they take capstone with me before they graduate, and we talk about how sometimes it doesn't work the way it's supposed to. We learn about people being wrongfully convicted. And so we have access to things like the Innocence Project research, the National Registry of Exonerations, which is very interactive. And so students can spend time exploring the over 3,000 people who have been wrongfully convicted of a crime and then later exonerated. And we can tie that into previous discussion from other courses. But we can do that because we're not bound to a traditional text that costs a bunch of money. And I can bring in things that are relevant because in the spring, last spring, I teach capstone. There was a case where someone had been exonerated, and I was able to just bring that material right into the module and introduce, this is what the case was, this is what happened, this is how they were exonerated. And the students appreciated that that was something that they could then follow up on because they could also follow the news, which when you're using a traditional text, and they do have those blurbs for those real world examples, they tend to not be as relevant because once again, there's that time difference between when the text was written, when it goes to press, when the student might be using it. But having something that is so timely, so relevant, I also think really builds that engagement for students. And so I have a bunch of different feedback from student surveys because one of the things when I started using OER is I thought that open educational resources were great. I thought that if I was a student that I would love this, that it would be a variety of ways to learn information, videos, peer-reviewed journal articles, plus open access books, plus we would have some kind of journalist style articles. I thought that all of that would be great, but that was me. So I was curious as to whether or not students actually found the variety of ways of learning information to be beneficial to them, and if they actually did learn anything. And I was very interested in the student success outcome because I wanted students, to be successful, to be engaged in the course. I also was just curious, did students feel like they were represented by using this particular style of information delivery? And of course, from an institutional perspective, is this going to improve retention outcomes? So I've asked students throughout their semesters to provide me with anonymous feedback on the course. I asked questions at the midterm point and again at the end of the semester. It's completely anonymous. I do ask them if they give permission for me to share this information with colleagues. So all of the examples that are provided have been taken directly from the feedback surveys with the students' permission. However, their name is not attached to the information, and they do receive extra credit points for completing the optional course feedback survey. So a lot of the themes of the feedback is that they've enjoyed the reading, they've enjoyed the material, that it was interesting to read, that they wanted to read it, that they felt like they actually learned something. Where in courses that I don't use OER, the feedback that the text is boring. The text is hard to read. There's a lot of material in the text. Now, using OER, the amount of reading is very similar to a traditional textbook chapter. It's just that the actual content is divided up into different ways. So a short journal over there, and then maybe a short video clip, and then another journalism style article to read. The amount of information is the same, it's just how it's presented is different. So some of the feedback includes that they've enjoyed the articles and videos, they've been informative and actually interesting. And that's, goes with a lot of the feedback from the traditional text that it's boring, it's not interesting, it's hard to read because it's boring. I enjoyed the videos and real life connections to what we were learning that module, like the prison education videos. It humanizes what we are learning and helps understand its importance. To me, that was like a prime example. It looks like I made up that feedback because it's highlighting the engagement aspect that I was looking for. It's the part about humanizing what we're learning, adding in that representation aspect, building up the inclusiveness of the course. So that to me is like, I swear I didn't make it up, but it seems like I did because it really highlights exactly what I was looking for. I also enjoyed the videos on prison so much and how they were in New York State, so it made it more relatable. So that's another huge piece, is when I'm building up material, I try to find things that are relevant to the majority of the student population. So at Hudson Valley, we're in the Capital District. I have some resources about specific programs in Albany County. There's a great documentary that was done on the Albany County Correctional Facility, the jail. So that's part of the module on jails, is to watch a section of that or watch all of it if you want, because the students are likely knowing someone who's gone to that jail. They may have gone to that jail themselves. They also, even if they have no involvement in the system, they probably have gone by where the facility is. So that also kind of builds some engagement because, oh, that's a real place. I've, driven by that place. I know where the Albany County Correctional Facility is. So having those connections, just local connections, I find that students like to learn about things that they know a little bit about. The links to the website with specific stories of people's life in the correction system were intriguing and educational. So also kind of just humanizing, building those connections between real life experiences. Because a lot of times criminal justice texts are, this is the system, these are the people that work in the system, and yeah, there's people that are locked up in a prison, but we don't really care about them. Kind of almost making it a little an abstract concept. Using some of these OER resources can really allow the students to recognize that the people that are involved in the system are part of the criminal justice system and are real people. I really enjoyed not having a formal textbook and your use of open resources. The articles you include and the videos you include increase the learning and provide excellent snapshots of the lesson for that week. It was unique and refreshing. Also, really highlighting some of the goals that I had for using OER that have that student engagement, increase the learning. That's awesome feedback. Knowing that the student felt like they were learning something from the material versus just being forced to read a chapter, and saying that it was unique and refreshing. So that unique factor, that novelty, can also increase engagement for students. And then just a second slide on student feedback from those same anonymous surveys. I liked the readings of the course. I liked how they were about the actual experiences in the real world and gave an idea of how correctional facilities affect society. I also liked how the readings were free online resources, so buying a textbook was not required. To me, that is such a big part of inclusiveness, that the students don't have to have that pretty pricey purchase, especially if they have to purchase all their texts at the beginning of the semester. That's a lot of money in a short amount of time. And at a community college, many of our students just cannot afford the textbook. And so students were just not reading. The textbook was like $135 that I had been previously using. They weren't buying it. And we had a copy on reserve at the library, but it just was not necessarily accessible for everybody to go to the library, spend time in the library, read the chapter, and then go on with whatever else they have to do that day. It just wasn't possible. So having the OER, having the digital resources means that students can access the material, from wherever. And so if a student is carpooling on their way to work or taking the bus, they can sit and they can read for 10 minutes before they get to their next stop. And, the students on break at work, they can, keep their tablet in their car, and then they can check out their reading when they're on break, just to kind of keep up to date with their coursework. Then they don't have to worry about having that physical textbook and the cost. The details about the prisons and jail system itself, I have a lot of family and friends who have been incarcerated, and I would think that they were being dramatic when they would come home and complain and have struggles. Now I realize there was more to it than I thought, and I'm glad I can now see things through a new lens. So that student not only learned about the experiences of people in the system, and as a general academic way, they also were able to kind of recognize the experiences of their family and friends, and just at a more social way, we're able to recognize people's different experiences. The reading material that was provided was great, as it provided real examples and experiences of topics being covered. And I think, I know for me, when I was a student, that was always an issue, is explaining a concept, but how is that concept really used? So if I'm explaining what probation is, how is probation really used? What is it really like if somebody's on probation? And so being able to provide that information for students, I think, is so beneficial, not only for representation and engagement, but just encouraging students to explore ideas even more. I liked reading the different articles and getting someone's personal experiences about the topic in question. Although some were extremely long, it got me into a better mindset about what it is we were studying each week. And I enjoyed learning through the articles rather than struggling to stay awake reading from a textbook. So overall, since I started using OER, the feedback from students about the open educational resources has been overwhelmingly positive. There was one student, and they were very vocal about the fact that they did not like that there was not a textbook. They wanted to have a physical textbook with 20 chapters, and they explained to me that they wanted to be able to open the textbook, read the first chapter, and then go on to the second chapter. That was how they organized their learning. And by using OER, that wasn't possible. We did work with the bookstore to provide a printed out physical copy of any of the articles or readings, so that a student would be able to purchase that. I think it was a $5 or $10 fee. It was just a printing fee. So the student was able to have a physical copy. Obviously, all the videos and things were still linked on Brightspace, but they did not like the fact that it was not a traditional text. That was one student out of, at this point, probably 350 students who I've had who have used OER. They were very vocal about the fact that they did not like that. I have not had other students express to me that they didn't like the structure of OER. It doesn't mean that there were students who or dissatisfied. It just means I only have that one who expressed it to me. But overwhelmingly, students felt like the OER was useful for them. The students were actually doing the readings, and that I can document just based on their writing assignments and their discussion board posts. They were referencing things that were from, the experience of somebody on probation or the experience of somebody in jail, the experience of becoming a police officer, things that were from the OER. I was seeing so many more references to actual required reading material versus a traditional text, when a lot of times you could tell it was just a Googled response. It wasn't actually based on the reading. I wanted to end with just if there's anybody had questions, or if anybody had any, their own experience using OER, if they wanted to share that. But for me, it's been so beneficial in my teaching, and I just think that the student success outcomes have just increased so much by moving away from the traditional text, really just to have those student experiences be recognized, and not just relying on that traditional text that kind of othered people who were involved in the system. Anybody have feedback, questions, their own experience they wanted to share? Jen, I'm not sure if anybody's actually out there.
Yeah, we do have some people still in the room. Yes, Corey's just responding. So glad you saw student feedback.
Oh, thank you so much.
I think everybody's being a little shy today.
That's okay. I understand. Sometimes when you attend presentations, you don't want to have to actually participate in them. Totally get that.
That's true. Well, if there's nothing else from the group, thank you so much, Casey, for a great presentation. And hopefully we'll see everyone in the next session. Thank you again.
Thank you.